The chamber was unanimous long before the vote was called. Delegations filled every tier, their voices already aligned by weeks of quiet negotiation and economic modeling that reduced a species to columns and projections. Earth had been categorized efficiently: high adaptability, high labor output, low political cohesion, a perfect candidate for administrative classification. They called it stabilization. They did not call it ownership. The difference mattered only in language, and language had never stopped anyone from doing what was profitable. 72 human observers sat in the upper gallery. Engineers, diplomats, logistics coordinators. People who had kept the conclave systems functioning for decades without ever sitting on the floor below. Among them, Director Elia Vance stood with her hands resting lightly on the rail, watching the delegates argue the final wording. She did not speak during the debate. She did not need to. The outcome had been decided before the first voice was raised. An elder from the outer coalitions requested the floor near the end. His voice carried the weight of age and something harder to define. "You mistake dependence for superiority," he said quietly. "You think control follows from convenience. It does not. It only appears that way until the convenient disappears." A few delegates listened. Most did not. The chamber had already moved on. When Elia finally spoke, it was after the motion had been prepared for vote. Her voice was level, almost conversational. "We built your corridors. We maintained your grids. We optimized your fleets. Not because we were ordered to, but because it was easier to help than to argue." She paused, letting the silence settle. Remember that this was a choice. Then she sat. The vote passed without resistance. Every panel lit green, cascading down the chamber in a clean, decisive pattern. Applause followed, restrained but satisfied, the sound of a system confirming its own logic. Below, agreements were already being drafted. Above, the 72 humans stood at the same moment, as if guided by a signal no one else could see. They gathered their belongings in silence. No one protested. No one looked back. Their identification badges were placed neatly on their seats, face down, as if closing a file. Elia was the last to leave. The door shut behind them with a soft, final sound. The chamber celebrated beneath lights humans had designed and maintained. No one noticed the absence begin. The recall orders were flawless in construction and irrelevant in execution. They spread across 14 systems in seconds, binding every human asset under the new administrative code, assigning roles, locations, and oversight chains designed for efficiency. By the time the orders arrived, there was no one left to receive them. Earth had not resisted. It had withdrawn. Ships departed quietly under existing permits, filed months earlier under routine transit classifications. Private fleets, independent carriers, civilian transports. Nothing illegal. Nothing that triggered alarm until it was already complete. The first failures were small enough to ignore. A navigation relay flickered offline along a minor corridor, rerouting traffic through slower paths. A pharmaceutical facility reported a delay in synthesis cycles, citing calibration drift no one on staff could correct. These were logged, categorized, and assigned for review. The conclave had processes for this. It always had processes. What it did not have was understanding. Within days, patterns emerged. Systems that had operated flawlessly for decades began to degrade in sequence, each failure exposing the same quiet truth. Human designed, human maintained, human understood. Without them, the systems did not collapse immediately. They stalled, looped, and waited for inputs that never came. Automation extended function, but could not replace knowledge. On Devon Reach, water reclamation units entered diagnostic mode, their firmware awaiting authorization from a server that no longer existed. On Praxis Station, shipyard power grids locked behind licensing protocols that required validation from companies dissolved 48 hours after the vote. Communication networks fragmented as proprietary architectures went dark, isolating entire regions into informational silence. Emergency committees formed. Engineers were reassigned. Reverse engineering teams worked without rest. Progress was negligible. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. The systems were not just built by humans. They were designed to be understood by humans. Documentation existed, but not in shared formats. Processes were recorded, but not translated. It had never been necessary. Humans had always been present. By the second week, the conclave stopped speaking in projections and began speaking in time. 18 days of pharmaceutical stability. 31 days of water. Indeterminate navigation reliability. Each number carried weight. Each countdown revealed a dependency no one had accounted for because it had never failed before. There were no attacks, no fleets crossing borders, no declarations of war, only absence, expanding outward, reshaping a civilization that had mistaken assistance for inevitability. By the fourth week, the conclave no longer spoke as a unified body. Delegations argued in fragments, each calculating losses in isolation, each searching for leverage that did not exist. The assumption of control had dissolved into the reality of dependence, and there was no mechanism within their system to reverse it quickly. Every solution required access to something humans had built, and every access point was closed by the same quiet condition. Legal personhood had been removed. Contracts had been voided. Rights had been revoked. The conclave had severed its own foundation. The message was not broadcast publicly. It arrived through a private channel, routed through an address that predated the conclave's current network architecture. Director Elia Vance received it without surprise. She had been expecting it since the moment the vote passed. The sender identified himself as High Delegate Reth Oren, his tone stripped of ceremony. "We request terms," he wrote. "No threats. No negotiation tactics. Just acknowledgement." The meeting took place on neutral ground, a station that existed in records but held no strategic significance. It was quiet, functional, designed for purpose rather than display. Elia entered the room alone. Reth Oren was already seated, the strain of weeks visible in the stillness of his posture. He did not waste time. "Name your price," he said. Elia placed a document on the table. It was not long. 3 pages, precisely structured. Restoration of human legal status. Recognition of all human-built systems as sovereign intellectual property. Reinstatement of contracts under new terms. And one clause, repeated in every section. Human labor is voluntary. Human withdrawal is absolute. Not granted. Acknowledged. Reth read it twice. His expression shifted, not in resistance, but in realization. This was not retaliation. It was correction. The cost of ignoring 40 years of quiet integration, of assuming that contribution implied submission. "You could have destroyed us," he said. Elia's gaze remained steady. "We didn't need to," she replied. The conclave reconvened on day 58. The act was rescinded unanimously. Systems came back online in measured sequence, each restoration tied to a new agreement, each agreement bound by the same clause. The lights returned, the water flowed, the corridors reopened. Nothing looked different. Everything was.